Welcome back to Chasing Hazel's Tales, a family history podcast where we deep dive into our family history stories and discoveries. We discuss our friend DNA and we share some of the great connections we have made. We appreciate you for listening. Hazel Laing was our grandmother, and her story was mostly unknown until now. Grab a cup of tea. I know I need one.
Always.
DNA plays a big part in the discoveries that we've made. The sources we will come to use more are the letters from the sweethearts Hattie Falloon and Carl Laing, and the diary of Georgia Laing, Hazel's mother. These are personal accounts of the life of the Laings in Enfield, and we are here for it. They cover everything from Hazel's railroad romance with Gerald Humphrey to butter wars to the hardship of World War II, and of course the weather. I'm Kim McLaughlin.
And I'm Laura Ireland. And for example, one of my favorites from Georgia Laing's diary is from 1938, November 17th, snow hard. I think every Mainer can relate to that.
And hard must mean 12 inches.
Yeah. And then the 19th, snow again. Good for hunters. And then on November 25th, Thanksgiving, snow 15 to 18 inches, hunters all marooned in the woods. So I guess some snow is good, too much snow is too much, but I think we can glean from this that the snow was so good for hunters, it marooned them out in the woods.
That's a good one.
Yeah.
So how about this one? These are just some examples of Georgia's entries. This one, March 19th, 1941. The most disagreeable day of the winter, 0 and heavy wind. So if you're from Maine, you can relate to that entry. You know exactly what she's talking about.
March can be cold.
Yeah, disagreeable is not what I would call it.
Yeah.
And as Mainers, we reserve the right to talk endlessly about the weather. Or maybe, but it's what we do. Like right now, I'm thinking, is it going to rain tomorrow? Is the drought over? I don't know, but that's exactly what I'm thinking about. And the last example is Georgia Laing's record keeping of her butter production. We all know how important the butter production is.
Yes.
If you had listened to our last episode, one of our last episodes, was it episode 2 or episode 3?
Honestly, don't remember.
Okay, look up the butter wars.
I think it was 2.
Okay, so Mrs. Roscoe, this is exactly word for word what she had written in there. Mrs. Roscoe Laing, years 1920 to 1927, inclusive 8 years, made and sold 37.428 pounds of butter. And there you have it.
That's a pretty sensitive scale, too. Yeah. So moving on with our story, last week, we may have spilled some tea a little bit.
A lot.
Yeah.
Spilled right over.
Maybe the whole cup. I don't know. But, we discovered what we didn't know we wanted to find. And I think that's a nice way to put it. Mm-hmm. It's a priceless new family connection. Maybe you heard us. Hazel Laing Burgoyne, our grandmother, had a relationship with Gerald Humphrey, which produced our father, Roscoe Burgoyne. Now, is that it? Is the story over? No. That gets us through approximately 1935. Now what?
No, it's not the end.
Yeah, no, there's still more. So we've come to settle on the idea that Hazel and her husband, Stan Burgoyne, were very different people. She was married right out of high school. She liked to socialize, dance, and was the most vivacious according to her senior class. And it seems like maybe they had very little in common and spent a lot of their time doing different things. And it makes sense to us that she had that relationship with Gerald, who it seems loved music and dance like she did.
Right. There's nothing shocking there. That just seems like, and I'm not sure. I think Stan had his own interests and was doing his own thing, but we have no proof of anything.
Right. Because we only have one side.
Right. Exactly. We only have one side. We're just assuming that there was nothing really in common going on there. So another question we had was, how long was their relationship, Gerald and Hazel? We've just read some letters from Hattie Falloon to Carl Laing, and one from September 1933, in which she went to a dance in Medford. And she said, I see Hazel and Mr. Humphrey down there. So we know as early as September 1933 that they were together and going places.
And was it before that? We don't know.
We don't know, but we don't have any way of finding out either that we know of yet.
Right.
You never know. In all the papers, something could pop up. But then again, it's mentioned in October of 1933 in a letter. He asked Carl, have you seen Mr. Humphrey? I hope they're going to have a dance. So it seems like social events and Mr. Humphrey were used in the same sentence quite often.
For sure. Yeah.
And then in November that same year, I'm glad you got Humphrey home okay, so they don't have to stop the train for him, eh?
So they seem to be quite good friends.
Right. So
they mention him all the time.
Right. And Gerald must have been, in with the Laing family, who worked for the railroad and probably good friends with Carl. I mean, so he probably had connections there because of the train. And we know we have the right Humphrey because they talk about the train. So that's the right guy. Mm-hmm. And then another note in December of 1933, and I want people's opinions on this. She mentioned, wasn't that terrible about the dance hall burning and those poor people? So Hattie mentions that to Carl, and this was 1933, and I wonder if anybody knows of a dance hall burning down and what happened to the poor people. I don't know. I'm interested in finding out.
I tried a Google search.
I
didn't come up with anything. No.
And I thought, the Coconut Grove fire in Boston, but that wasn't until 1942. So I don't know what it is, but it's, they mention it and it was something serious.
Mm.
So in January 1934, Hattie writes, what have you been up to? Listening to some good program on the radio? Gee, I wish Mr. Humphrey would get one of those radios up here so we could have it by Sunday, don't you? Gee, I'd like to have one. Then we could eat popcorn and listen all we wanted to.
Such high aspirations.
Sunday night, we're going to listen to giving them just a little bit of leeway there. There was nothing else to do and listening to the radio.
That's true. It must have been the newest best thing. Everybody wanted a new radio.
And I think Gerald in his military training had a lot of training with radios.
Oh, so, that's right.
That's right. So he must have been in the know about where to get them and how they worked and how they, could be used, that kind of thing. So he was probably the go-to guy for radios. And then in January 1934, again, she writes, did you make arrangements for Humphrey? And did he find out anything about the car? So I don't know if he was just jack of all trades and Hattie wanted him to get everything for him because he could get it through the railroad and deliver everything, but he was the guy.
She seems to be depending on him for stuff.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean,
oh God. Know. And then again in February, here goes. She writes, I hope it isn't cold tomorrow night. I don't want to take Humphrey downriver. Gee, I hope he finds something definite about that car this week. I'm so gosh darn sick of fooling around with some old bus and not being able to enjoy yourself wherever you go. So she was tired of taking the bus. She wanted Humphrey to provide a car. Somehow I don't know if the one was broken but she didn't want to take him down on a cold night, wherever downriver was.
Apparently I don't know. That was not convenient.
No. So yeah. So there's just mentions from early 1933, September 1933, and the letters continue. So he was in the mix there that whole time. So it's hard to know exactly how long Hazel and Gerald had a relationship.
Right. So, and thinking about it, probably at least from 33 to 35. And then we're just kind of left with a lot of questions. I don't think there's really any way to get answers to them. We don't know if Gerald knew he had a child in Enfield, and we don't know if there was more than one child. Hazel had 3 children, and the one was taken care of by the Burgoyne family on her death, so Aunt Georgie, so that makes sense that she was Stan's child. But Patricia, the second born, was not, just like our father wasn't. And so she has no biological descendants. So we can't really know. We can't do this same type of DNA investigation to find out anything for her. So just kind of left with questions about that.
Could suspect it, but we can't prove it.
Yeah, there's no way to prove it.
There's nothing written and there's no DNA. So there you have it.
Yeah.
So you might think that would be the end of that story, but for me, it's not. Because if you want to talk about DNA, there are advances recently in DNA that you can extract DNA from artifacts. Meaning, let's just say Laura licked a stamp, and then 10 years later, I could take that stamp and send it to a company, and they can extract DNA from it.
That's crazy.
It is kind of crazy. And so fine, they can take the DNA out of it, but then you really can't prove whose DNA it is. Like I could say, oh, this stamp was from Laura. But unless you were right there watching her lick it, how would you know? Right. So it's fraught with problems. It's it's being developed, but it's only kind of used for genealogical purposes right now. There's no legal way to use it. It's just for experimentation and genealogical purposes for right now. But it is a thing that's coming, just so you know.
Right. Yeah. But, if there were to be an example of something we thought were Pat's, then
right.
Certainly she would show up if they were able to put it through Ancestry.
Right.
We'd be able to see the connection, and be able to assume that it might belong to her. But,
right. But that's all right now. It's really expensive and it's a little time consuming. And I just have more important things to do. But it is interesting that they can do that. And someday, I don't know, I imagine a big web where we're all plotted out somewhere and everybody knows everything. But for now, we just have no way of knowing. So that it kind of is the end of the story for wondering about that question.
For now and for our resources. Yeah. But, I guess maybe this is the episode of questions, Kim.
Right.
One of the questions in your mind, people might ask, well, do you still consider yourself a Burgoyne?
Mm-hmm.
And, maybe each of us might answer that differently, but I don't know. I don't think so. I think we all feel the same way. I think that the answer to that is yes, because that's the family you're raised with is your family.
Right. I agree.
Yeah. You can't take 55 plus years of being a Burgoyne and erase it, because that is the people we have all these memories with, we raised, and learning you have a new family doesn't take away from what you already have.
Right.
So, no one's looking to change their names or anything. I'm not sure what most people would think, but that's how I feel, is that we're just expanding our family.
Right. I call it the bonus pack, the bonus family.
That is,
we just have a bigger tree now.
Right. And so Stan was our grandfather growing up. We weren't particularly close with him, but there wasn't a negative relationship either.
Right.
But we didn't see him often, but he was always kind to us. And he was Dad's father until the end. And they expressed that bond over the years. And if they knew anything different, and I probably think they did, they never said anything and never let it get in the way. So, I kind of assume that both Stan and Dad knew. But like they never talked about it, and
there was no proof. So how would we know?
Right.
We're just kind of thinking, how could they not know?
Right. Yeah. And apparently most people in the town knew that Dad wasn't Stan's child.
Right.
So.
It did seem to be an open secret. Like everybody knew it, but nobody said anything. At least to us, we didn't know it.
Right. Yeah.
Yep.
Don't tell the ones affected by it. No,
that's right.
Don't do that.
And so even though Laura and I both have expressed we prefer to have the truth, how this worked out for Stan and Roscoe Burgoyne over the years seemed to work out for them. It didn't rock any boats. And I think that was how they wanted it. Mm-hmm. So maybe it was kind of this stance where my name is on the birth certificate, so that makes me the father. And that's not horribly wrong.
Right. They are it's the legal father.
Exactly.
It may not be the genetic father, but.
Right.
Yeah.
And so even though he may have known it was not, it didn't matter. His name was on the birth certificate. And so until he took his last breath, Roscoe was his son.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yep.
And, it brings me right back to my favorite quote from Danny Shapiro's Inheritance book. I may not be who I thought I was, but I am who I always have been. And I think that kind of looks into that question that's always, around nature versus nurture, which one is stronger. And I think for us, we would say they're both vital.
Right.
The family you're raised with creates love, hopefully, shared memories, family bonds. But it's also crystal clear to me that nature cannot be denied.
Right.
The genetics are undeniable when it comes to personality, looks, interests, and abilities. I mean, you just have to look at a few pictures and you see the connection. And I think we've been very fortunate to have the family we were raised in, along with the new family we found through DNA. And I can't quite describe the feeling. I'm sorry. I'm kind of at a loss for words, but I can't imagine not knowing what we've learned.
Right.
And having the truth of the whole story and the understanding of the dynamics of our family because of these truths has just, there's a sense of peace, a sense of, I don't know. I just feel so much better having all this knowledge.
Right. So the good, the bad, the ugly, it's all important, and it all plays into the picture that we know. And now it makes sense.
Right. And unlike in the movie A Few Good Men, we can handle the truth.
Yeah, we can. Unless
I had to throw a movie quote in.
Yeah. All right. So we're going to kind of move on a little bit. That's kind of a recap and what we learned. But so we know most of Hazel's family. And when we say that, it's mostly the adopted family, the Langs of Enfield, Maine. But there was a biological family in her life as well. And so here's what we've learned about that. If you recall, Hazel Hensler was born on Deer Isle in 1909, and she was sent to the children's home in Augusta when her mother died. But then she was adopted and raised in what appears to have been a loving home with the Langs in Enfield. From pictures and diary entries, we know that she was able to connect with her biological family as an adult. So just for reference, her biological siblings were, and she had several, her biological siblings were Gus, Ernest, Grace, Percy, Myra, and Bernice. And Bernice was called Bunny.
I like
Pat
that.
told me that. Yeah. And then Julius, her biological father, Julius, did go on to have a second wife, Mary, and they had a son named Robert and a daughter named Helen. So there's lots of people there that, she got to discover.
Right.
So,
and keeping on with kind of following the diary entries to kind of guide us through this episode, we have the first entry in Georgia's diary regarding the Hensler family. It was dated a few years after our father was born, Roscoe. So in 1938, there's an address listed for Bernice Newell at 110 Holland Street in Lewiston. And it's the same address as her father, Julius Hensler. Okay. And then it skips to 1941, August 3rd of 1941, where Stan and Hazel went to Deer Isle. And we have a picture from that day on the Deer Isle Bridge, which is very cool because you can see Hazel's red sweater. I like it. And Stan looks very dapper. And November 16th in 1942, Hazel papered the front room. So, and a little bit later.
I think she was getting ready for a visit.
Oh, well, yeah, that's true, because the next entry from the 19th to the 21st of November of that year, Francis and Vera from Sunshine, also, part of Deer Isle, visited Hazel. So those would be her sisters-in-law. And then a year later, in September of 1943, Hazel, Phyllis, and Eleanor went to Deer Isle. And isn't it funny, Kim, that we lived in Hazel's house and we lived in Phyllis and Eleanor's house? I find that very...
Oh my God, I never made that connection. It's Phyllis and Eleanor.
Phyllis and Eleanor, yes.
Eleanor Curtis.
We bought their house in 1972. That's where we grew up.
Oh my God, I didn't even make that connection.
Yeah.
So Phyllis, Eleanor was Eleanor M. Curtis, who our elementary school was named after.
Right.
And we bought her house when we moved to Enfield because when
Dad retired. Yep.
Right. When Dad retired, we, for a short while, lived in the Laing house, which if you remember from a couple of episodes ago, I mentioned how cool it was. I loved it. It was an old farmhouse right in the village. We lived there until we bought Eleanor M. Curtis's house.
Right.
And
pink
she went
plaster walls and all.
Oh, they were something else. They were pink. They painted anyway. Yeah, that was something. But that's Phyllis and Eleanor. Oh, thanks for bringing that up, because I didn't make that connection at all.
Yeah. Yeah. And then another entry from 1946, Hazel was home from Lewiston. So, there were just a lot of short entries, but they do show quite a bit of the things. And this is just an initial look at them. There's definitely more coming up. But so our understanding is that when she found out she was ill, Hazel was able to have her adoption records unsealed. And that's when she reached out to her family. So we think that maybe she was becoming ill around 1938. It's a guess.
That's a ballpark.
Right. It's a ballpark. And I think although it's a little bit of a different scenario for her, I think she experienced a similar thing to what we went through, connecting with unknown biological family later in life.
Another similarity.
Mm-hmm.
So we can relate to meeting new biological family. we have pictures of her and her biological family together, and she must have been surprised by the resemblances, just like we were. We even said that it was eerie to see, when you look at the new family, you see the same hands, the same mannerisms, the same hairlines, the same twinkle of the grin. And she must have felt all of those too, looking around and seeing it could have been different things, but all the similarities.
Because you definitely can see the similarities in the pictures with her family.
And the first thing that dawns on me is the hairlines.
Yes.
They're all very similar. They all have the very similar hair and the sizes and their faces. It's certainly genetic.
Right.
But so what we really don't have any way of knowing was how much they were in contact with each other, except from a few diary entries and a few photos. But some of the pictures, they look pretty happy. And, so it must have been, cool to find them after all that time.
Right. Because we do know that her father, Julius, sent her a picture of himself playing the cornet. I don't know if you pronounce it cornet or cornet.
I don't know.
But it's a small trumpet.
Yeah.
He was in a uniform playing that instrument. And the letter was dated 1941. And Julius Hensler would die on May 20th of 1945 at 73 years old. And even though they knew each other, he didn't mention Hazel in his obituary. He mentioned his other surviving children. And, again, more questions. Like I wonder how much they thought of her over the years. And were the Hensler children splintered? Because they were raised in different homes after their mother died? We don't know what those dynamics were like.
Yeah, maybe they didn't have a lot of contact with each other. We just don't know.
Right. But, I wonder if they thought of her at family gatherings, at Christmas and Thanksgiving. What was that like? And to know that they had a little sister out there and that she was somewhere else. They didn't know her.
Right. But we did have an opportunity to meet one of Hazel's biological nephews this past winter. His name was Cliff Wood, and his mother was Grace Hensler Wood, Hazel's sister. So he could recall the day that Hazel died and how upset his mother was when she learned of that passing. And he remembered them being close, but he himself had not met Hazel. But at least we actually talked to one person who remembers that day. I mean, and
right.
So Grace, and at least we know Grace and Hazel knew each other and were close, somewhat close.
Right. And what a great meeting that was. I mean, I just have to say that meeting Cliff was a big highlight for me. What was he, 102? Or was he just shy of his 102nd birthday?
I don't recall the date right now. That we just met him just not even a year ago. We met him in January.
Yeah.
He passed shortly thereafter. Right. But we were so thankful.
What a great opportunity. Anyway,
Yep.
So if we believe that she opened her adoption records because she knew she was ill, then that would date her illness starting around 1938. And so her age would have been around 29 years old. And her mother's diary is filled with references to treatments that Hazel had. And it's really, I don't know, it's very sad for me because, it's knowing that was my grandmother that was going through all this, and her mother who was suffering, watching her daughter suffer. Right. So December 9th of 1942, Hazel's first treatment was an X-ray.
That's what that is. I don't know.
Yeah. Tried to kill cancer by causing more cancer. I don't know.
I don't know. And they probably didn't know either.
It's like a double negative, right?
Yeah.
So November 10th of 43, Hazel went for treatment today on her hands, had eczema. And January 20th of 1944, Hazel went to Bangor. Later in 44, Hazel was home from Florida tonight. I don't know if that was treatment or respite. Hard to say.
Right, we don't know.
Must have been a long train ride, though.
Yeah.
And then later again, Bangor for treatment today. Georgia and Stanley with her. And then later on the same month, Hazel in bed, leg bad. I think there was a problem with the veins in her leg, stomach upset, and some you can't read the writing.
Yeah, stuff you can't read.
Yeah. And, Hazel had treatment today. Hazel to Portland and Boston with Monroe and Olive. Hazel returned from Boston. Hazel in Bangor. Hazel to Bangor for treatment the 11th and 13th. And then November of 44, she's in the hospital for an operation on her face caused by ulcerated teeth due to infection. Infection and ulcerated teeth. Dentistry wasn't great in the day, so it might have been just normal. But I'm sure any treatment she received didn't help those teeth any.
No, it was. Yeah. I just can't imagine what the healthcare was like. I just don't know. So that's other questions. What exactly was she receiving for treatments? But growing up, we were told Hazel had leukemia, which had a very low survival rate at the time. But based on Georgia's journal documenting treatments and trips, there was an extensive effort. I think they were able to seek treatment in many different places. I can't imagine the expense or the logistics of making all these trips in the 40s. The 40s were tough. More on that next week. But so again, we really have no way of knowing what her treatments were, just that they made great efforts to help her as best they could. But it was our understanding it was leukemia.
Right. And throughout all of this, looking at Hazel's story, I keep thinking of our own father. So
Right.
Dad, Roscoe, in 1940, he'd have been 5 years old, not very old. And he's watching his mother become more and more ill. And from the sounds of it, his parents' marriage was difficult at best. No way of knowing exactly what it was like. But, and his grandmother, who was probably one of the rocks of the family, she sounds like she tried to keep it all together, but trying to keep businesses afloat, help her daughter. And there's the drum beats of war from across the pond. And what about the children? Who's taking care of the children? And again, it's a different time. Children were not coddled, but I think that this would have been very traumatic for her children to live through this.
Right.
All of these things.
Who knows what they were told?
Right.
Is the mother's sick, or what would they have told? I don't know. I just can't imagine what they were told. So what I remember, one time talking with my aunt Georgia Burgoyne, and one time she said to me, she just said, and she was speaking of Hazel, she said she was gone all the time. Roscoe was by himself a lot. So I assumed at the time that she meant that Hazel was partying, but I don't think so.
Doesn't sound like it, does it?
Now that I read all these other things, I don't think she may have been, because she was the most vivacious. And
when she was she was probably at the dances.
Right. And when she had an opportunity, she might take a bit of fun, from time to time.
And who can blame her?
But I don't think she had a whole lot of fun. I mean, it seems like she learned she was ill shortly after Dad was born.
Yeah.
And so there weren't many times for her to enjoy partying or anything for that matter.
Right. So I think we've learned through all this that defining a family can be tricky, and it can take more than DNA. And kindness and understanding can go a long way to coming to terms with it all. And I think everybody having a good attitude toward it has really helped us. It's
right.
Everyone's been great with all of our discoveries and our endless talk about DNA and family.
And what does Georgia's journal say today? She has some quirky things in there, and like we read, and some really heartbreaking things in there. So far we've gotten into the hunters getting stuck, and trips for Hazel and things like that. It's just a mishmash of funny things and then really heartbreaking things. So as Hazel's life goes on, all of these stories, say from World War II, her illness, her marriage, and the Laing family, they all arc into one very long, difficult spell for the entire Laing/Burgoyne family. And next week, we pick up Hazel's story further along in time, where letters we have show it was pretty ugly in 1940s rural Maine.
Unfortunately. Till next time, take care. And if you're wondering about your family history, take the time to ask the questions of your loved ones. Don't wait. If you've done that, tell us that great story. We can't wait to hear it and might share if possible.
And don't forget to rate, review, follow, or whatever the little buttons tell you to do on Apple, Spotify, and all your favorite platforms. And then go tell all your friends. And we'll see you next week.